Welcome to Liberty Unlocked. I'm Don Watkins. So today I'm really excited. We're talking to my friend Brad Thompson about a book he wrote on the Declaration of Independence and really the thinking that made possible the Declaration, the whole Enlightenment view of man, of society, of reason that shaped the ideals of individual rights, of equality. And I think this kind of perspective on ideas is really helpful. And in particular, the thing that I think is useful is if you're at all prone to rationalism, which is a concept we've talked about in this show a few times, which is ideas kind of floating in the air, cut off from reality. It is really helpful to look at how these ideas actually get discovered, formulated, and applied by people who were trying to put them into practice, to actually create a country and govern a new society. And what you see is that there's not at all a rationalistic approach, that these are ideas that are always thinking about how are we going to implement them? What does this imply for the structure of government, for the nature of government, for different policies? I mean, this is the era in which we have the best evidence of what it looks like to really think about how to use rights as a way to organize society and organize a government. And so being familiar with that is, I find, really rich and clarifying, as well as just frankly inspiring. And it's also one of the few times that we get the phenomenon that Ayn Rand talks about in her article Anatomy of Compromise, where we often get a situation where a country is mixed, but it's in the grips of evil principles, and that we become more and more consistently aligned with those bad principles. And this is a case where a country set out on good principles wasn't consistent in the implementation, and we moved in the direction of becoming more consistent, at least in the case of slavery and in several other spheres. And it's a really good examination of why it's so important to clearly define and articulate and fight for good principles, and the way in which a contradiction is going to get worked out, and yet the working out is painful, so that it's all else being equal, to understate the point, it is better to be consistent and consistently good. The other thing I would say is I think there's a lot of opportunity for doing stuff in history and the history of ideas. And I've talked about this in various forms, but I really want to stress it here because I think Brad does such a phenomenal job in this and his other works at helping us understand the history of ideas. But if you truly want to be able to understand objectivism in its full power, being able to see how it's engaged in the history of ideas and how it relates to the other ideas in history. And then if you think making a case for a philosophy, particularly in the realm of politics, though not only there, having actual history as a background and a proper understanding of history so that we can really make sense of what principles led to what outcomes. All of this is, I think, a very underexplored area, and something that, as we talk about in this interview, something I want to see more of. And I think it's really, in certain respects, baffling and definitely tragic that in the whole, let's call it, at least since the 50s or 60s, where you got something like a liberty movement, that there has been very little of this, very little reliable, objective, good history. And I mean, thankfully, I think there's been more in the founding era than probably any other aspect of history. But if you talk about the Industrial Revolution, and certainly the kinds of issues that I touch on in my book Roosevelt Care, about what was happening to the working class and how are people coping with poverty and things like this, there's just so much that's underexplored, all the way to even more recent history. And something like, okay, why have there been stagnating wages, and to what extent has there been actual stagnation among people? Things that Iran and I touch on an equals unfair, but even just getting the history of the last several decades and what lessons we can draw from that is something that has been underexplored. So there's so much work to do in history and the history of ideas, and it's really valuable for our own clarity, and then it's certainly valuable in terms of persuasion. So I hope everybody will take inspiration from that, and hopefully there's people out there who are going to take that ball and run with it, over the next coming decades. But with that, I want to get right into the interview. The best way to stay in contact is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. And in the meantime, be sure to like this video, hit subscribe to the YouTube channel or iTunes or wherever you're listening to the podcast, and talk to you soon. All right, Brad, welcome. Glad to have you on. So actually, this is exciting. I've done a couple interviews with people about books, but this is the first time where I'm going to go over the top and just highly recommend this book right here. It's America's Revolutionary Mind. We're going to talk about it, but I've known you a long time, and I've loved your work for a long time, but this one really blew me away. But I wanted to go back. I forget when I first heard about you, but I know when I first you came on my radar screen as somebody I wanted to follow your work. And I think one of the really looking back holes in issues objectivists had tangled with, and people interested in even freedom, I think, had tangled with, was the issue of slavery and race. And the first time I remember it really being addressed in circles of people interested in Ayn Rand's ideas was in 2006, when Debbie Gatte gave a brief talk that was really good on Frederick Douglass. But the next year, you gave a course on, what was it, American Slavery, American Freedom, where you really went into the history of the abolitionists. And it was breathtaking for me. Shamefully, I hadn't learned about that history in school. I hadn't learned about the history from all of the pro-capitalist writers that I've read, and the passion that you brought to it and the way in which you helped see how this fits in with the history of freedom was really breathtaking. And I'm curious, just to take a step back, how did you get interested in ideas, in history, and how did you get to broadly where you are now?
Sure. So I think the first thing I have to mention, in certain ways, maybe even the most important thing, is that when I was about 7 years old, as a young boy, born and raised in Ontario, Canada, I read a children's book called The How and Why Wonder Book of the American Revolution. And that was the moment when I realized that I was an American born in the wrong country. And from that point forward, I've had this lifetime love affair with the United States. And that continued all through my childhood and high school. And then the second big moment, not surprisingly, in my intellectual development was right at the very end of high school. I read The Fountainhead. And that had the biggest and most profound immediate impact on my life. It was instantaneous. And then from that point forward, I became really very interested in ideas. I've been interested in ideas in high school, but like every student, I think probably everywhere in the world, high school education is mostly disgrace and it's anti-intellectual. So my only intellectual interaction was with a few friends, one of whom introduced me to the Fountainhead. Then I went to college and I walked into my first political philosophy class, and I had the most phenomenal professor I've ever known to this day, who changed my life, at least in the sense of my professional aspirations. And that was it was a gentleman named Paul Loudenslager, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but he and I would sit in his office with Plato's Republic open in front of us. He had his copy, I had my copy, and we read it out loud to each other. And I would read a paragraph, we would stop, he would drill me for 10 minutes, and then we'd move on to the next paragraph. And we went through the text like that. And that was the moment when I really became it was the moment when I realized that this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And
well, let me ask you a question about that, because That's really fascinating, that kind of experience. So is there any way you can describe sort of in pattern? Because I mean, this is the way even people who uh, are interested in ideas, but who haven't really made it a profession will read even a thinker like Plato or Ayn Rand, the way that we'll read like, you know, Stephen King, right? You start at the first word and you keep going and you nod your head. And once in a while you go, I don't get that. You keep going. And then, oh, I read that essay or I read that book. And I think to get something out of a profound thinker, it is that kind of paragraph really sinking your teeth in. Did you have like a self-conscious methodology? Was it just riffing of, oh, I wonder what he means here? Were there kinds of questions that you were learning to ask and kinds of ways that you were learning to attack these texts?
Well, there were two things happening at the same time in my intellectual life. So I was reading Ayn Rand on the one hand, and then I was also reading these great texts in the history of political philosophy on the other. So, you know, Ayn Rand gave me first the passion that ideas matter in our lives, that ideas have consequences, and that they have the power to change your life in the here and now. But in these courses in political philosophy, it's not so immediate. I mean, you're talking big ideas, but you're talking about how ideas change over the course of several thousand years. So for me, the two worked well together, right? I got the initial motivation, the initial passion for ideas from Ayn Rand she taught me that ideas matter for my life here, now, today. But also reading Plato and Aristotle and Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Marx, Nietzsche, etc. I also got to see certainly Ayn Rand's ideas in the context of the history of philosophy, but also I got to see, how it is that we got communism and Nazism in the modern world, how it is that we got the United States of America, the role that ideas played in the creation of the American and French revolutions, for instance, is something that's always interested me. And then also the role that ideas played in the rise of classical Greece or Rome. So it was a combination of these two different events that were happening at the same moment in my life, which just sort of it changed my life, because up until that point, just to be perfectly honest, some people know this about me, most probably do not. I was an athlete. I went to college to play football and run track, and I did. And so, when I was in high school, the Don Watkins of the world probably would have called me a jarhead because I was about sports and didn't care that much about school, other than the conversations, very intense and passionate conversations I was having with a close circle of friends outside of high school. But then that 4-year experience in college, everything changed. I went from being a young man who thought almost entirely about athletics to someone who thought almost entirely about ideas. By the time I graduated from college, I had very little interest in athletics, and at that point, I had at least tentatively told myself that I was going to enlist in the battle of ideas that is taking place and has taken place, of course, in the history of humanity from the very beginning. So it's been a big part of my life, and in fact, it's really the only thing I have in my adult life. Right? This is all I do.
Yeah, well, you're certainly one of the most productive people that I know in terms of creating content and high quality content. So what did you have a conception that was more specific at the end of your where did you go to undergraduate?
I started at Queen's University in Canada and then transferred for athletic reasons to a small school in Colorado called Western State College. So
at that point, did you have kind of a clear idea of what you wanted your career and ideas to look like? And so kind of how did it take shape that, you ended up on the trajectory that you did?
Yeah, I did. I knew I knew by the time I graduated from college that I wanted to be a university professor. So as soon as I graduated, I went and did a master's degree. And then I took 2 years off, which was one of the best things I've ever done. And I taught high school at an all boys boarding school for 2 years. And then I went on and did my PhD.
Well, that's interesting. What did you get out of that experience that you found so valuable?
The teaching high school?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was fabulous. I mean, so it was my first teaching experience. So when I walked into my first high school classroom, that was the first time I'd ever stood in front of a class to teach, right? And no education degree, no practice teaching, none of that stuff. They just throw you in the deep end. And I was fortunate because I got to teach what I really liked, which was the history of ideas. And I taught at a very elite school. And let's put it this way. I had a class of seniors, 2 of whom went to Harvard, 1 went to Brown, 1 went to MIT, 1 went to Stanford. So, and this is also teaching grade 13, right? In Canada, back in the day, we had grade 13. So my students, these grade 13 students, were the equivalent of American college freshmen. And it was the very best possible students you could imagine. So these kids were just wildly engaged in ideas, one of whom is today a college professor. And, but what it really did, Don, was this. So I took those 2 years off really as a test to determine whether I wanted to devote the rest of my life to the intellectual life and to being a college professor, because it's going to graduate school and doing a PhD is a huge commitment. In the humanities, PhDs, certainly back when I was doing it, the minimum amount of time was 6 years. And it was somewhere between 6 and 10 years to get a PhD. So it's a huge commitment that uses up the best and most productive years of your life. So the decision I had to make was this: is being a college professor the only thing that I want to do for the rest of my life? And the test was to take these 2 years off, teach high school, but at the same time, every night when I got home from teaching class, which was usually about 8 o'clock at night, because I also had to coach as well. I get home at 8 o'clock, and I spent the first of these 2 years, as soon as I got home and had dinner, I would listen to Dr. Peikoff's History of Philosophy lecture series. And I mean, it took me a full year to listen to the lecture series. I took detailed notes. And so I told myself, if after the end of 2 years, if you still have this burning, yearning passion for ideas, if you know at the end of this period of time that being a college professor is the only thing in the world you want to do, then you'll know it's the right thing to do. And at the end of those 2 years, it was an easy decision, and off I went.
I mean, I really like the idea of having a kind of test for yourself, particularly when you're making that kind of long-term commitment to something like graduate school. So you went to graduate school. What did you end up doing your thesis on?
So my thesis was on the political philosophy of John Adams.
Okay, and that makes sense because, I mean, that I think probably will be superseded by this book, but that was what you're most famous for, is your scholarship surrounded by John Adams. Is that right?
Yeah. So I was known for a long time in the academic world as the John Adams guy. And so, so my dissertation was on John Adams. And then after I finished graduate school, then I went to London for a year, revised the dissertation, turned it into a book, which came out in 1998. The title is John Adams and the Spirit of Liberty. And then for years, the only speaking gig I could get was on John Adams. That's all. That's the only thing people wanted me to talk about was John Adams. But of course, at that time, I mean, when I finished the Adams book, I never read John Adams again. Any John, right?
When did Mccullough's biography come out? Because that's the first thing that put it on the public radar, which you would, I assume, preceded, if I would recall.
Yeah. So my book came out, I think 2 years maybe or so before Mccullough's. But it came out close enough to Mccullough's that I was able to ride the Mccullough tsunami. So, that John Adams book did actually really quite well, but it did well before the Mccullough book came out because it got some big reviews. It got reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, for instance, and so it did in a pre-Amazon world. It did very well, and then I was able to ride Mccullough's wave for a while as well.
So there's so much I want to talk to you about, but I think a good starting point is your new book, which is really on the ideas, and in particular the moral ideas that informed and made possible and then were used to interpret the Declaration of Independence. And I want to start by kind of stepping back and getting a wider perspective about I think people who are not schooled in philosophy, or certainly not, fans of Ayn Rand, don't have a real perspective on, like, the creation of America. Just seems like this, we on the one hand take it for granted, and on the sometimes it'll just be put as like a literal miracle, right? Like, it's just a miracle. You had these people who happen to like say, okay, we'll be for freedom. And part of what you highlight in the book is that there was centuries, and indeed in certain respects, thousands of years of intellectual history that was informing the period that gave rise to the United States of the Enlightenment. What do you take as when you try to think about something like the Declaration of Independence, where's your starting point? Because you do look at it in a wider context, but you're trying to also remain focused and not let your thinking just diverge in 1,000 directions. So I'm curious as to just where your starting point was in thinking through this issue, and then thinking through how you're going to present it in your book.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I started with the Declaration, right? And I read, I taught the Declaration of Independence for many, many years. And so I got to know the text pretty intimately. And actually, I had no intention to write this book. In fact, at the time, I was actually writing a different book, which is now going to be volume 2 of what's going to be a trilogy on the American founding. And the second book, the second book in the trilogy that I was writing 4 years ago, is going to be titled America's Constitutional Mind. And I wanted to write just one short chapter on the Declaration of Independence, which I thought would be easy to do, given how much time I have spent thinking about it and teaching it. And then I read this incredibly bad book on the Declaration of Independence by a professor at Harvard. And I thought to myself, this cannot stand, right? The same 7-year-old boy who read the How and Why Wonder Book of the American Revolution could not let this book on the Declaration by a Harvard professor stand because it was so atrocious. So I made a deal with myself that I was going to take time off from this larger book on America's constitutional mind, and I was going to write a very short, brief book on the Declaration of Independence as a counter to this other book. And I literally told myself, you have exactly 365 days in which to write this book, this what was going to be a small book on the Declaration. And so I started on July 1st, and I wrote in kind of a white heat for every single day for the entire year. And then on June 30th, the following year, 1 year, literally to the day after I started, I finished it. And so that was the spur. And of course, it turned out to be a much larger book than I initially anticipated.
Well, this is just as an aside, Brad. So I knew that you had written this very quickly in a year. And so I expected, like Cato will put out books that are, like 100 pages, you kind of get it. And I receive in the mail, like, it's not a tome, it's not intimidating, but it's substantial. Like, it's really gives you a lot of depth and reflects, the kind of research of a lifetime. So I can definitely speak to the surprise from the reader, let alone the author.
Yeah, well, it was quite a year, and as I said, I wrote in a white heat every day for the entire year. And I have to tell you, it literally just sort of poured out of me. I couldn't write fast enough. In certain ways, it's the easiest book I've ever written, even though I think it's the most complicated and sophisticated of all of my books. But it literally just poured out. So to get back to your question, I began with the Declaration of Independence, and that was the plan. I was just going to write kind of a close textual analysis of the Declaration. But then a funny thing happened on the way to the market. I read a passage by John Adams, a famous passage where Adams said that he asked the question, what was the revolution? And he answers it by saying, it was not the war. It was not the war for independence. He said the true American Revolution was a revolution in the minds and hearts of the American people during the 15 years before a shot was fired at Concord or Lexington, which was in 1775. So when I read that passage, that just sort of opened up everything to me. All of a sudden, it became clear to me that all of the other histories of the American Revolution had missed the single most fundamental part of the American Revolution, which is that it's a moral revolution. And that was Adams's point. The second quotation that reoriented the way I thought about the book was a line that Thomas Jefferson wrote about the Declaration. In 1825, he described the Declaration of Independence as an expression of the American mind. Now, what does that mean? Well, if it's an expression of the American mind, that means it is a summing up of the principles that Adams had been talking about, right? That moral revolution that had taken place in the 15 years before the Declaration of Independence. So I took those are the two starting points, Adams and Jefferson. And so what was going to be just a small book on the Declaration turned into a much, much larger project on the American Revolution as a whole. Now, how do I do it? So this is not a chronological history of the American Revolution. It's what I would call a thematic history of the American Revolution. So I use the Declaration of Independence as a kind of ideological roadmap. So the book follows, the chapters of the book follow the logic and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So there's a chapter devoted to just the first sentence of the Declaration. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them to another and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate station, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've got a whole chapter on the first sentence of the Declaration, a chapter on the first clause of the second sentence, which begins famously, when we hold these truths to be self-evident. So a whole chapter on the nature of truth and self-evidency. And then, of course, the Declaration then lays out its four self-evident truths, and I devote 2 chapters to each of the 4 self-evident truths. And what I do is in each of those chapters, or on the 2 chapters that I devote to each self-evident truth, I give a kind of intellectual history, usually beginning in the late 17th century with John Locke, who I think is the philosophic founder of the American Revolution. And then I trace Locke's ideas as they cross the Atlantic, land on American shores in the late 17th, early 18th century, and then how they percolate down and through the culture via the universities. So there are 4 self-evident truths in the Declaration: equality, rights, consent, revolution. And so I devote 2 chapters to each of those truths, giving an intellectual history of each of those 4 self-evident truths.
One of the things I found really interesting is certainly I could see in the Declaration and things written during the time, the influence of Locke. But I mean, you give quite a few space on the way in which they were very self-consciously. I mean, many of the founders named Locke of one of the three people, along with Bacon and Isaac Newton, as the three most important people who had ever lived, which is a little parochial of them. I mean, it's, you know, there were some people who came before that who seemed pretty important. But in any case, but one of the interesting things about the way that they would talk about him is, though you would think they might be emphasizing the political ideas, and they did to some extent, it was really his epistemology, which from their perspective was the epistemology that was behind science, the theory of knowledge that made science possible. I'm curious as to what do you see as how they understood the connection between his kind of more basic philosophic ideas and a free society? Because I don't think that connection to many people is that obvious.
Right. So, excuse me. So Locke, of course, was most influential and famous in the American colonies during the Revolutionary period for his great treatise in political philosophy, the so-called Second Treatise of Government. And that's the one that that most college students, even today, in our corrupted universities, we still teach Locke's Second Treatise of Government. But in many ways, it was his work in epistemology, titled An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which was, I think, in certain ways, more important than the Second Treatise of Government. And the Essay Concerning Human Understanding was taught in American colleges. So John Adams, for instance, when he was an undergraduate at Harvard, and Jefferson as an undergraduate at the College of William and Mary, they all read Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is a very sophisticated, very complicated work in epistemology, half of which is above my pay grade. However, I will say this, and I think I have contributed to Locke's scholarship by identifying what I think is actually the single most important thing about the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is that it's actually not a work in epistemology. It's actually a kind of prolegomena to any future morality, to riff off of the title of Kant's book. Right. So what Locke was doing in the Essay Concerning Human Understanding was he was trying to establish something that had never been done before, which is to create a demonstrative science of ethics. He described himself in the essay as the underlaborer to Sir Isaac Newton. And in the same way that Newton had discovered the physical or scientific laws of nature, Locke's task in the essay was to discover the moral laws of nature. And for Locke, what he was really trying to do was to establish what he called a demonstrative science of ethics. That is to say, an ethics that can be derived, he called it, his methodology, he called his historical plain method, which was a very inductive way of trying to understand and acquire knowledge about human action and interaction. And so Locke developed, even though he rarely ever used the term natural rights, he's considered to be the philosophic father of the term natural rights, but also the idea of the moral laws of nature, which would then provide a kind of, not just a demonstrative science of ethics, but a secular science of ethics. And I think that by far is the single most important part of Locke's treatise, which is never discussed because everybody thinks of it as a work in epistemology. So what America's founding fathers did then was, inspired by Locke, beginning in 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act, they began a 15-year search for moral principles, in particular through the doctrine of rights, that would be considered absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. And that could be demonstrated philosophically to be so. And, and so, long story short, I think, Locke's influence on the founding fathers, on their political philosophy, was profound. I mean, they all read Locke's Second Treatise of Government, but the best of America's revolutionary thinkers, people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, they also tried to bridge the gap or the chasm between, let's say, epistemology and ethics.
I think what comes out in your book is the way in which the kind of unifying thread was, in order to know how we should live and how we should structure society, we have to have a view of human nature, and part of that is human knowledge. So they were looking really at an integrated view of human beings. So they did not, and Locke certainly didn't, they didn't treat philosophy the way it is today. Like, oh, you do kind of philosophy of the mind, and then you go off in your corner and you do some kind of narrow topic in epistemology. It was, we're trying to understand human beings and how they should live. And so epistemology is, we need to understand the mind, since that's the central thing that makes us human and is going to unlock science and help us design a government. Going to sort of the bridge then into rights, one of the fascinating points you make, and you put the distinction, is there was a very long-standing view of rights that you kind of call historic view of rights. And forgive me if I get the terminology exactly wrong. And that a big part of the transition that happens during the 15 years leading up to the Declaration is the shift in viewing it from a historic perspective to, these are natural rights, rights based on our nature as human beings, universal in our nature as human beings. And how do you see that transition as taking place, and to what extent do you think it was just clarifying their thinking? To what extent do you think it was kind of counter ideas that push them to think deeper? What was the kind of process by which we see that transformation and how they talk about rights, from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of man?
Right. So, let's say in 1760, the American mind was divided. On the one hand, they were loyal subjects of the British Crown, and they thought that the British Constitution was the single greatest constitution of world history. And they saw themselves as the inheritors of this English tradition, and in particular, they saw themselves as the inheritors of inherited rights. But they were the rights of Englishmen, not natural rights, the rights of Englishmen. And the rights of Englishmen are the rights of a particular people at a particular place at a particular time. And the rights of Englishmen, of course, had evolved over the course of almost 800 years. So in other words, the rights of Englishmen were embedded in history. And if you wanted to understand your rights as Englishmen, then you had to study history. But at the same time, because of the influence of Locke, and Locke really sort of hit American intellectual life beginning, I'd say, in the 1720s, and starts being taught in American universities. It's certainly at the Ivy League schools, Locke was being taught. And for Locke, however, the emphasis is not on history, but rather on nature. And of course, this is part of the entire Enlightenment tradition, of which Locke is the great pole star. And so the Americans are learning from Locke that the single most important thing to study out there in the world is nature. Nature is the standard, and the means by which we understand nature is reason, right? And through their analysis, through their study of human nature and of the conditions necessary for human prospering, they really drank deeply from the well of Locke's natural rights teaching. So anyway, in 1760, you have two things happening at the same time in the American mind: a devotion to the rights of Englishmen, and on the other hand, a devotion to the idea of natural rights. But those ideas conflicted in 1765, because when the Stamp Act is passed in 1765, it is in part defended by British imperial officials on the grounds of the British Constitution and the rights of Englishmen. And so, but the Americans knew fundamentally that the Stamp Act was wrong, that it violated their rights. But it did something more than violate their rights as Englishmen. It violated their rights as men. And so they began this search. It was really by then a 10-year search for a standard by which to ground their rights. But that standard had to be granite-like. It had to be a permanent standard. And so they were looking for a conception of rights, which would become the rights of nature, that would be absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. And that's the moment when they finally sort of break through and reject the doctrine of the rights of Englishmen and reject the British Constitution, and become proponents of the idea of the rights of nature and of a new kind of constitutionalism. That's the revolutionary moment in the development of America's revolutionary mind. And that's the story I try to tell in the book.
Yeah, I feel like we could spend 10 hours on each chapter, but I definitely want to go to what to me was, it was the moment where I had to like literally set down the book and go, wow. Which was the way that you handle the conflict between equality and slavery. There's, I think, two kind of false approaches that basically monopolize most of what I've seen before this. So you can have the kind of left view, which now we're seeing crystallize in 1619, that essentially all of this natural rights and everything, they were hypocrites. They were using that to rationalize protecting slavery. That was the essence of America, or at least if you don't take it to that extreme, that like this is a kind of major discrediting of the founders, and you can't hold them in esteem, and that in effect that they people. I mean, I can remember even back in high school, back in the 90s, what they really meant was all white men were created equal. But then there's the other side, which is the complete whitewashing and minimizing of slavery and looking for excuses. And it's, no, we can't blame them. They were men of their time. And this is, I would say, the highest compliment I can pay you is this is the first fully objective assessment I've seen of this issue. Tell me, I'm interested in how your thinking evolved on this and how you decided to address it in the book, because I really do think it. If only for this issue, people really have to buy this, because from my awareness, you'll see nothing else like this on what is a really crucial issue.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Don. So originally, I didn't plan to write a chapter on slavery. In fact, it was the second to last chapter I wrote, even though it's the fifth chapter of a 12-chapter book. So I wrote this chapter over the course of a few weeks, probably in May, just before I finished the book as a whole. And I did it because I was trying to anticipate the criticisms of the book. And so I've just written an entire book on the Declaration of Independence with a chapter on equality, and I don't talk about slavery. I knew that wasn't good. I knew that could not stand, that I had to write a chapter on slavery. So I sort of threw myself into it, and the thing that I tried to do was to not drag into the past the concerns of the present. Even though there's a sense in which I was motivated by the concern that I would be challenged for not having a chapter on slavery, but I wanted to give American revolutionaries their due. I wanted to understand them as they understood themselves. So what I try to do in the chapter is I try to recreate their mental and their moral universe as they grappled with this very difficult issue. And it was a tortuous issue for many of them, particularly those who were slaveholders. So one of the things that I try to do in the book is I take the hard cases. I mean, I give an overview of how all of America's founding fathers understood the issue of slavery, and there was a whole spectrum, right? At one end,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to highlight here, because I think people could take the idea of, oh, I wanted to take them on their own terms the wrong way, is in effect, well, I'm not going to, judge them objectively or be soft to them. No, part of taking them on their own terms is who are let's look at the arguments made by the most consistent opponents, as well as the people who had slaves and were trying to rationalize it. Well, you'll probably talk about the way in which it's oversimplifying to say that they rationalized it, they wrestled with it. But you get that better views were there, views that we would say today got it right. And in fact, got it way more right, because they understood at a much deeper level the evil, whereas people just kind of, oh, we all know that it's evil, but they don't really think about why it's evil and the depths of the evil. But I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to stress, like, you'll get you get the whole range of views.
Right, yeah, and there was. So at one end of the spectrum, there were people who were absolutely anti-slavery and who never owned slaves. John Adams, for instance, never owned slaves and was opposed to it as slavery his entire life. And then you get a second group of people who, like John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, who owned slaves, but they owned what were called house slaves, which were basically servants. Now they were slaves nonetheless, because they were owned by Franklin, but and John Jay and many others, particularly in Pennsylvania and in New York, but they freed their slaves very early in their lives, and then on top of it, both Franklin and Jay became, after 1776, they became leaders of the anti-slavery movement and did as much as anybody to try to abolish slavery. And then you get people like George Washington. This would be a third camp, who owned slaves his entire life, but freed his slaves upon his death or in his will. And then finally, you get to the hard case, the fourth case, which is people like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. And they're the ones that I try to focus on the most, because I wanted to see how they really struggled with this issue of slavery. And the fact of the matter is, they did struggle with slavery. Now, you have to keep a couple of things in context, however. The fact of the matter is, slavery literally had existed all over the entire globe throughout all history. So slavery throughout human history was I don't want to say it was normal. That would not be true, because obviously, morally speaking, it's abnormal. But it was an institution that had existed throughout all time. And in the American colonies, all of the founding fathers, no matter what their view, like Jefferson and Henry, for instance, the tough cases, they viewed slavery as a necessary evil. Now, you have to understand why they viewed it as necessary and as evil. So the first thing to note is they viewed it as evil. So Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, in private letters that they write, talk about how evil it is, and that they have compromised their moral character by engaging in this evil. It was necessary, they thought, because they did not understand, they could not figure out how to deal with what I call the post-emancipation problem. Right? It's easy for all of us in the 21st century to look back and judge and condemn slavery, but try to put yourselves in their shoes and try to understand, and this is what I try to do, try to understand how and why people like Jefferson and Henry why they were so tortured by this. Because as Jefferson once said, we have the wolf by the ears and we don't know whether to hold on or to let go. And the thing that they all feared was a race war, right? And the question, how do you free people who have been enslaved their entire lives? How do you do it? And do you just free them and just say so long? See you later. And how are white and black races going to live together in the same community? And Jefferson said that the slaves have every reason, moral reason, morality is on their side to slaughter whites. But if that's the case, then why would the whites free their slaves if they think they're going to die? So the point being, it was a dilemma that they couldn't work their way around. Now, I do, of course, in the end, though, I do judge and condemn people like Jefferson and Henry for not freeing their slaves. They should have, and they didn't. And they should be morally judged for not having done so. So consider the following scenario. I mean, this is, I know this may be hard for some objectivists to hear, who are great fans of Thomas Jefferson, but consider the following hypothetical. Imagine one of Thomas Jefferson's slaves escapes, runs away, and Jefferson mounts his horse and tracks his runaway slave for 2 days, and then finds him in a forest. And it's just the two of them, man to man. What is the right of the slave in that situation? And the answer has to be, of course, that the slave has a right to kill Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's and that's the kind of moral clarity that you take to it. It's not simplistic, but it's principled. And being principled in complex situations, this is what it looks like. It doesn't look like you have a cookie cutter thing that gives you an answer, and certainly not an answer that you necessarily love all the details of. So there's so much more we could say about the book. I want to ask, a lot of the people who follow me are interested in doing intellectual work. They're interested in writing communication. One thing that fascinated me, and that we kind of alluded to or talked about briefly, I think you mentioned you wrote the book almost inspirationally, and yet it's one of the most research. I mean, I think you even mentioned in the foreword or the introduction, there's sources here that people have never referred to, or possibly, even certainly brought into the scholarship before on many of these issues. And I know the difficulties of kind of weaving in a lot of different research. How do you approach a task like that? Like, are you, writing and organized note cards? Or, I ask because I'm actually at the other side. Is I have a whole bunch of disorganized things, and when I'm in the mix of writing a book, I can just remember, oh, I saw this thing that was relevant there. What is your sort of approach that allows you to weave together all of this incredible historical data to be able to write your story?
Yeah, so in this case, it was very complicated because I was doing several things at the same time. The first was, as I said, was writing a close textual analysis of the Declaration of Independence, but doing so in the context of the history of colonial America, which meant that I had to read the texts I had to read John Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, his Second Treatise of Government. I had to read all of the British political theorists who basically, like Trenchard and Gordon, otherwise known as Cato, they're the authors of Cato's Letters, who basically transported on a kind of intellectual conveyor belt Locke's ideas to America. So I had to read all of Cato's letters in 2 volumes. And then I had to read
2 thick volumes.
2 very thick volumes, yeah. And then, I will tell you that I read every single major pamphlet by the major American revolutionaries that was published during the time. So I read everything on the revolution by James Otis, Daniel Delaney, Richard Bland, John Dickinson, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then on top of that, I tried to read almost all of the published sermons of the revolutionary period. And then I read probably hundreds of newspaper articles. So that's the other thing about so this book is, it's organized in a very complex way, using the Declaration as a template to tell an intellectual history. But it's also, I'm looking at not just the ideas of great political philosophers and great American statesmen, but I'm also looking at the ideas of pastors and ordinary, everyday, uneducated, hardscrabble farmers living on the frontier from Massachusetts all the way down to South Carolina, who were writing newspaper articles. So there was just a huge amount of material. The bottom line is this, though. As I said, I used the Declaration for this particular book was a kind of roadmap. It provided the framework for the book as a whole. And I knew that almost from the beginning. And then it was just, I have boxes and boxes and boxes of Xeroxed newspaper articles from the period. I've got, volumes and volumes and volumes of collected works of American revolutionaries from the period. So it did require, and this was probably the most difficult part of writing the book, is synthesizing all of that material, right? Which means you got to throw out probably 3/4 of everything I read. And only, I had to separate the wheat from the chaff and only keep the best stuff, but not just the stuff of the primary revolutionaries like Adams and Jefferson, but also taking the best of these mechanics in New York City, or these uneducated farmers in Western Massachusetts, and incorporate them into telling one story.
Well, I've never seen anything like that for this period, and it helps you. It certainly helps me, because I'm always thinking about how do ideas proliferate in a culture, and to be able to see the form in which they're being consumed by people and not just articulated by the most intelligent, thoughtful, leaders of the time. It gives you, part of what it gives you is, man, even the common man in the street was really getting kind of abstract, sophisticated ideas compared to anything that that's a little unfair today. I think the ideas are bad, but you'll even see today, like the person on the street may have heard of something like, nudge, or the idea of, predictably irrational, or Malcolm Gladwell. Right. But the Malcolm Gladwells of the time were writing about the ideas of Locke instead of what's going on today. I guess the way I want to end is, what is your thoughts or advice or wishes to see? I think one of the undervalued areas, certainly amongst objectivists, but I'd say people interested in liberty generally, is history and intellectual history. I think there's so much more work to be done there that I'd like to see. What are your thoughts on that, and kind of what encouragement you can provide for people who want to go down that sort of path?
Well, I think it's actually necessary as objectivists to be doing work in these areas, particularly, let's say, on the American founding period. And here's what I mean by it. When Ayn Rand published Atlas Shrugged in 1957, American culture was very different then than it is today. It was very different. And I think the success of Atlas Shrugged in the first decade after it was published almost certainly had something to do with the fact that there was a much healthier culture, intellectual culture in the United States at that time. And more specifically, what I mean by that, there was a much better understanding and appreciation of the ideas, principles, and institutions of the American founding. And I regard Atlas Shrugged to be the great American novel. And it's the great American novel because it's the first and it's certainly the most important novel ever written that is a defense of the idea of America. Now, it's, of course, it's a lot more than just that. But I think for most people, for the millions of people who read Atlas Shrugged on a subconscious, if not a conscious level, they read Atlas Shrugged as a defense of America, a country which they had some understanding of and certainly a love for. Today, however, the situation on the ground is very different. We now have a substantial part of the American population which has nothing but contempt for the principles and institutions of the American founding. And we see it every night now in Portland and in other cities around the country. And we see it in tearing down certain statues. I mean, once you start tearing down statues of Abraham Lincoln, you know there's a problem. Yeah. And Lincoln, of course, was the great defender of the principles of the American founding. And when you get something like the 1619 Project, which regards which regards America to have been founded in sin, which therefore means the American founding is immoral. And you have not only college students, but students K through 12 who are learning this every single day. The culture on this specific issue has been corrupted. And how can a culture, think about it this way, Don, a nation that hates itself cannot stand. And how can a nation, and this particular nation, the United States of America, how can the United States of America hate itself and appreciate Atlas Shrugged? My point is this. I think that if we're going to make Atlas Shrugged great again, part of that will be based on making the American founding great again. And so that's what I've devoted my career to. And I would encourage anyone who loves this country, as I do, and you may know that I just myself, despite having lived in the United States now for 40 years, I became a citizen on July 14th, Bastille Day.
That's
the irony.
All right. No, but congratulations. I mean, I think some of us who value Americans deserve you. And I think the country in its fundamental meaning does, but I think there's a lot to be upset about. But yeah, I agree that there needs to be a real, I would say, reappreciation, but I want to stress that, it's not just a kind of rose-colored glasses fondness, but a deep understanding kind of appreciation for the American founding is important. I think your book, if that happens, will play an important role of kind of laying a foundation for here's, the core ideas that made this country possible. And then there's a lot more work so that people can recognize that what made it possible made it great and can make it greater if we can take those same principles and apply them to the unique problems of today. Because one of the things that you show is that the founders understood precisely because they were naming moral principles founded in human nature. That's what made them universal, not just across people, but across time. And that's why they had no illusions that life would stay the same and that circumstances would stay the same. But they knew that human nature would stay the same, a nature based in that we lived by reason, we gained knowledge by reason, we had autonomy. You have a really spectacular outline of how they thought about human nature. And that can therefore be valuable in our own time, that, some people dismiss them as, oh, well, that was nice for the agrarian age, but what about, an advanced technological society and a far richer society? It's no, because they were fundamentally moral thinkers, even more deeper than political thinkers, and that the politics emerged from that moral view, and that moral view is, at least in fundamental terms, right. That I think is let's put it, the potential staying power of America and of the ideals it was founded on. So Brad, how can people find out more about your work? And obviously everybody, you can get your hands on the book, any bookstore, if bookstores are still open, and certainly online, but how can people stay in touch and learn more about what you're doing?
Sure. So I have a relatively new website, C. Bradley Thompson, all one word, cbradleythompson.com. A lot of my recent talks and interviews are there. A lot of my sort of more recent public articles, partisan polemical essays are on my website. So that's one place. I'm also on Facebook, and I'm actually now, against my better judgment, on Twitter, where I've been for the last few weeks. And I can always be reached at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism at Clemson University.
Awesome. There's so much we didn't get into, but hopefully we'll be able to re-examine it another time. I want to do a whole thing just on the insights you brought to the issue of Marxism, and there's even John Adams, there's so much to talk about, but this has been amazing. Best wishes, Brad.
Don, thanks very much. This is one of the most, if not the most enjoyable interview I've done, and certainly the best questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.